Everything we now see, all of space, all of time, all of the galaxies, all the matter, all the radiation, everything that makes up our universe did not exist. And then it existed.
Well, welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. My name is James Walker. I'm an evangelical Christian apologist, working with Watchman Fellowship, a ministry focused primarily on interfaith evangelism. I'm also the co-founder of the Atheist and Christian Book Club, and we are a monthly gathering of both believers and skeptics, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. And very excited about the guest author we have. I'm going to have him introduced to you in just a moment. Just a reminder to everyone that this is a respectful dialogue. We want to avoid any kind of personal attacks. We're going to be talking about a specific book today, and we're going to have more on that later. Our other co-founder is Bill Cluck. Bill Cluck is a former Christian, now atheist, and Bill is going to introduce our special guest. Okay, Bill?
Right. Man, we are really lucky to have Lawrence Krauss. What a great advocate for atheism and reason and science. And let me just tell you a few things about him. He's a theoretical physicist and cosmologist. He was born, I think, in London. He grew up in Canada. He's taught at Arizona State University, Yale University, and Case Western Reserve University. He actually got his PhD from MIT. He's debated William Lane Craig and John Lennox. I would love to see, Lawrence, you debate Hugh Ross on Unbelievable. Have you ever heard of that?
I know Hugh Ross. I think I've been asked to debate him a few times, but I'm not interested.
Okay. Anyway, Unbelievable is a podcast out of London that's very popular, and Justin probably really falls over backwards to be. But anyway, Lawrence has had numerous awards. He's written numerous books. He wrote A Universe from Nothing, The Physics of Star Trek, and I think your latest book, Lawrence, is The Greatest Story Ever Told.
No, that was my second to latest. The latest book is called The Physics of Climate Change.
Okay, great.
Came in March of this year.
Well, man, we are really lucky to have you, and looking forward to all that you can.
I would be remiss if I didn't show it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Hey, by the way, when I was looking at your bio, I looked at your memes, which were just fantastic. And my favorite one, which probably is the one you're known for, Teresa is actually going to read it.
Oh, okay.
It says, every atom in your body came from a star that exploded, and the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust.
Doesn't that sound like scripture? I mean, that sounds so profound. I mean...
Yeah, but you forgot the last line of that.
Oh, Teresa, how dare you?
The last line is, so forget Jesus, the stars died so you'd be born.
Hey, anyway, Lawrence, do you want to say a few words before we go back to James?
No.
Okay. All right, James, take it from here.
Okay, well, I'm excited about tonight. I did want to take a few minutes to just do a little bit of housekeeping of what we have coming up. We do have the last month's book club. Is the videos up on our website, atheistchristianbookclub.com. If you missed that and want to watch it, we had David Beck talking about Does God Exist? A history of answers to that question. So that's available. Great book clubs coming up in the future. Next month, on September 2nd, we're having Stephen C. Meyer, Return of the God Hypothesis. He's going to be talking about his book. He's also author of Darwin's Doubt and Signature in the Cell, several other books as well. So that's going to be an important book club. We're looking forward to that. And then the following month in October, we're going to have Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is we're going to be looking at his book, Misquoting Jesus. He is a New Testament scholar focusing on textual criticism of the New Testament. He discusses the historical Jesus, origins, development of early Christianity. He's a former evangelical who is now identifies either as agnostic or atheist, kind of depending on the context. He's arguably today's most popular skeptical critic of the New Testament. He's written and edited 30 books, including 3 college textbooks and 6 New York Times bestsellers, including some books we've dealt with in previous book clubs, How Jesus Became God, and his book, Jesus Interrupted. We're going to be looking at probably his most popular book on October 7th, and that is Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. Bart Ehrman's currently Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and was a great influence to our co-founder, Bill Cluck, and so Bill's always pushing to have some more Bart Ehrman. Now, this is his first time to actually join the book club live, but we do have a challenge with this. Bart Ehrman does have a speaker fee, and we're going to try to raise that speaker fee if possible. And so his fee is $2,000 for 2 hours. And but I want you to know that all that money of all his speaking fees, not just what he might do with us, all that does go to charity every year. So what we want to do is try to raise some money on that. Hopefully we'll have more than just 7 to 10 minutes that we're able to raise. We want to try to raise the whole 2 hours if possible. But anyway, we've got a donation page set up for that. Your gifts are tax deductible. And if you go to watchman.org/Bart, it dumps you right into that place where you can help us to be able to raise the money to bring in Dr. Ehrman. So again, our special guest today is guest author Lawrence Krauss, and A Universe from Nothing. And Lawrence, we actually did, in the very second book club that we had a number of years ago, 4 years ago now, I guess, that was the second book we looked at in the club. We don't have a recording of it. It was the early days. We were just 8 or 10 people sitting around a table. But we had some great interaction, and so I'm so excited that we're able to have actually look at the book again, fresh look at the book again, and to be able to actually have you as author to clarify. One of the things I really liked about the book is you did, I think, a really good job of getting the cookies off the top shelf and bringing them down for the rest of the kids. You explained it in a way that I could understand your point. And I think I could understand what you were trying to say without having, a background in, cosmology or physics or anything like that. So,
well, that's good to hear. I mean, that was the reason I wrote the book, and the book was really, the purpose of the book was really to talk about the revolutions in our changing picture of the universe, and framing it around the question, why is there something rather than nothing, was one way to do it, but it really is about how our picture of the universe has changed. I'm also feeling badly that I didn't charge you now that I'm here.
Boy, you could have been like Bart.
No.
Well, we'll pass a plate right now. We'll pass a hat.
And there's also one thing I meant to say when you asked if there was anything I wanted to say, which I, because I didn't, I showed the book, but the foundation that I run, the Origins Project Foundation, is runs events and also the podcast that we run, which is the Origins podcast with Lawrence Krauss, and we have an amazing set of guests over the last year and a half, about once a month, ranging from Nobel Prize winning scientists. This month, after today, Barry Barish, who won the Nobel Prize in physics, I think we're releasing that episode. But we have authors and some of whom are atheists and some of whom aren't, and celebrities like Ricky Gervais and directors like Woody Allen and Werner Herzog and magicians like Penn Jillette as well as Ian McEwan, writers. So the idea is to connect science and culture, and so it's not in any sense an atheist podcast. Actually, there's an interesting discussion you might like with Martin Rees, who was the president of the Royal Society and a cosmologist, an astrophysicist, and a friend. But we had a pretty he won the Templeton Prize, and we had an interesting discussion in that podcast about science, but also about religion. Anyway, so I just wanted to let people.
How would we access the podcast?
Well, there's two ways. One, you can go to the Origins Project Foundation website, originsprojectfoundation.org, or you can go to the YouTube. They're video podcasts, so you can go to YouTube and see them after the fact. Just go to the Origins Podcast with Lawrence Krauss on YouTube, and you'll see them. But the other way, of course, which is, and it supports the nonprofit foundation that I run, is to become a Patreon supporter of the Origins Podcast, and then that's tax deductible, but it does go to the Support the Foundation, which we run a number of things, trips for people to interact with scientists and others, and literary people and cultural people, and also we are now finding that the pandemic is well, it's not over, but hopefully will be slowing down. We delayed it, but our first public event will be in 2022 in Phoenix, but it'll be broadcast live, and it has Noam Chomsky and Jeffrey Sachs, and then we'll have at this point it's not 100% firm, but in April we'll have a public event about cosmology, the current status of cosmology, tentatively with Martin Rees in it, and Wendy Friedman, who's head of the Hubble Space Telescope project, and Joel Silk, who's a distinguished professor of cosmology, and also Andrea Ghez, who won the Nobel Prize recently, and potentially also Kip Thorne, who also won the Nobel Prize recently. So it'll be a neat public event in cosmology, which will follow up on maybe some of the things we'll talk about today or not. Anyway, that's all that's the commercial messages.
Good. Daniel, could you put us a link in the Friends of the Atheist Christian Book Club Facebook page, so that it'd be easy to just click and go have access to that? Yeah, could you do that for us?
Yeah. The YouTube thing is free. The only difference, the YouTube has these annoying commercials that come on, but whereas Patreon doesn't. But it is free, and yeah, I'm very pleased. The discussions are not short. Some of them go on for 2 to 2.5 hours, just so you're aware.
Well, I'm going to pitch over in just a minute. I'm going to pitch back over to Bill Cluck to kind of ask a first question. But I want to let everybody else know that's in the room. We're still having people come in. If you have a question or comment for Dr. Krauss, if you will put in the chat and let either Brady or Daniel know they are co-hosts, and they will queue it up and kind of get you in line for that. So Lawrence has been kind enough to take our questions about the book. We are talking, let me just verify, we are talking just about the book. In the book club, we tend to want to chase rabbits a lot, and it seems like half the book clubs end up talking about the problem of evil in one way or the other. We want to try to stay on the topic of just the book, a universe from nothing, and keep it on that this time.
I can solve the latter problem. Just say the universe is evil, and now we can move on.
Okay, so we finally resolved the question.
Yeah. Okay. It's certainly trying to kill us anyway.
I don't know what that is.
Okay.
Somebody's phone's going.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Okay, so we have Dr. Krauss, all your stuff is available on YouTube on the Origins Project for free, right? So we'll link that.
Yeah, the Origins Podcast. If you go to the Origins Podcast with Lawrence Krauss on YouTube,
Gotcha.
That's just the podcast. The Origins Project Foundation webpage has many of the more things that are going on in the foundation. And of course, my own webpage, which you probably already have, the lawrencemkrauss.com, has all the things I write, things I appear in and stuff. So someone maintains that.
Well, Bill, do you have a question, comment to kind of help us get started?
I sure do. And it's actually nice to actually have someone that knows what they're talking about, and that's someone that's kind of like from my camp, because I get my cosmology from Hugh Ross. I started a chapter when I was in Raleigh, North Carolina. But some of the problems us atheists have is the fine-tuning arguments, Lawrence. And one of the things that Hugh says is one of the things that points to a transcendent creator outside of space, time, and matter is the origin of the universe. that you have in the beginning a hot Big Bang, 3,000 degrees or whatever, that in 1 millisecond expands to, I don't know, and to answer this, whether it's a grapefruit or size of a grapefruit or the size 100,000 light years, but it's at a quick inflation. Mm-hmm. And apparently if it goes too fast, then the galaxies, you won't have matter formed and the gravitation won't work and they'll just fly away. If it goes too slow, you're going to have this black hole crunch and you just won't get life at all. So it has to be on a razor's edge, fine-tuned, so that and plus answer me this, because like I have this, keep in mind, I don't know what I'm talking about here. So, but you have the mass density of the universe too, which Krauss says is like a piece of paint on a battleship, that if it's not just right, then this thing doesn't work. Help me out here.
Well, I mean, first of all, he sort of misinterpreted things I wrote a long time ago about the nature of the universe and what you might think is fine-tuning. I'll tell you about it too, but because I've written about this, because there's been a resurgence, and one of your future speakers is also misunderstands what's going on in cosmology, and there's been a resurgence of this. I actually wrote a piece for Inference magazine on cosmology and fine tuning. It's a short piece, and why there isn't, why there's no fine tuning. I mean, why it's certainly not evidence for some intelligence in the universe that's determining it. The point is that there are many things that if there were things that were different about the universe, then life, as we know it, wouldn't exist. But that's true on Earth. I mean, you might ask why is life on Earth and not anywhere else, and the answer is because those conditions are just right. But that doesn't imply that if you have a whole selection of planets around different stars, all of which have different properties, you're going to find that life is fine-tuned for the universe rather than the other way around. Life is fine-tuned for the Earth because obviously it couldn't have arisen otherwise. So organic materials, water, sunlight, all exist here, and it's therefore not too surprising that life on Earth is built on those things. It's not too surprising that our life finds itself existing in a universe that seems to be habitable, at least in rare places. By the way, most of the universe is uninhabitable. Most of the universe is trying to kill us. So if you were designing a universe for life, this would be a pretty crummy design, because almost all of the universe we couldn't live in. And as Carl Sagan, I think, once said, it would be an awful waste of space if you created a whole gigantic universe so in one remote corner life could exist. But the point is that what people aren't realizing is that life is fine-tuned for the universe, not the other way around. Life evolved in certain conditions in which it could evolve. It is very similar to the statement, isn't it amazing when you look down at your feet that they exactly touch the ground? They don't end up a micrometer below the ground, nor are you floating above the ground. They're exactly the right length. Your feet are exactly your legs are exactly the right length, so that your body touches the ground. And of course, when framed that way, it sounds remarkable. But of course, we realize it's not remarkable at all. It's just gravity works so that our feet touch the ground, and the conditions of the universe are such that they could be very different, and life could still evolve. You could imagine universes that would be more hospitable for life. The big surprise, and really the subject to some extent of A Universe for Nothing, was work I was involved in, but the fact that the dominant energy of the universe resides in empty space, and that's a big surprise, and it's changed our picture of the universe. And the energy in empty space is remarkably small, and it looks like it's fine-tuned. It's 120 orders of magnitude smaller than you would imagine otherwise, and if it were any bigger, we wouldn't be around. And so people say, wow, that's fine-tuning. Clearly someone had a design there. But the point is that if the energy of empty space was precisely zero, which is what we thought it was 25 years ago, now, gosh, it's 1995 is when we first proposed it. Wow, it's 26 years ago now. Time flies. Anyway, if it was exactly zero, which is what all physicists thought in the 1980s and early part of the 1990s, then in fact the universe would be more habitable for life and it'd be much more natural value. So it's not, it's true that if we're much bigger, we wouldn't be here. But if it were much smaller, the universe would be and more natural, it would be the universe would actually have more life, there'd be more places in the universe that life could evolve over a longer time than it can. So whenever you see something like this, and you can't necessarily explain it, people want to ascribe purpose to it, but the conditions are such that, I mean, you'd be very amazed to find yourself living in a universe in which you couldn't live. I mean, it'd be like, as I think I've said before, and I probably said in the article, it'd be like an intelligent fish, wondering why his universe is surrounded by water, is full of water, because the answer is, if it wasn't water, the intelligent fish wouldn't have evolved to be there. And so the fact is that life evolved on Earth and in the universe under the conditions allowed by the physical conditions at the time. And it's not too surprising, therefore, to find that it appears, just like it appeared before Darwin, that the Earth was specially designed for life, until we realized it was the other way around, that life had evolved to fill the niches that were available on Earth. Same is true for the universe. It's just a kind of cosmic evolution. It's not too surprising to find that the general parameters of the universe are what, if they were different, we wouldn't be here. But if they were different, something else might have evolved. That's the point. And it's, so it's very myopic to argue that the universe that the whole properties of the universe were fine-tuned so we would be here. The correct way to think about it is that we evolved to be, so that our bodies and our all life forms maximally exploit the conditions that were available in a universe that was old enough and large enough and for life to evolve in. And I mean, I can talk about it in more detail, but it is true that there are many things that appear to be fine-tuned, but then the problem is, when you actually understand them, they're not fine-tuned. We used to think that the energy levels of carbon and were just such with nitrogen and helium. Actually, the reason we're here is that if you want to talk about how we got here, not why we got here, in the sun, there's a reaction which is incredibly important, and in stars, and that is, so hydrogen burns to form helium. 4 hydrogen nuclei come together ultimately, and by nuclear reactions form helium. But it wouldn't go any further. It turns out that 3 helium nuclei have to come together ultimately to produce carbon. And if there wasn't a very special energy level of the nucleus of carbon, then they wouldn't be able to exist long enough for that to happen. It seems so fine-tuned that people used to say, look, that's proof of God. But now we understand that just arises out of what's called quantum chromodynamics, the theory of the strong interaction, and nuclear physics. Energy levels are what they are, and that process happened to happen. But it wasn't. There was no fine-tuning. It just is what it is, and so. But it's true, if that wasn't there, then no elements heavier than helium would likely be formed until probably for large stars, supernova explosions, and then heavier elements would form. But and so it's putting the cart before the horse to say that the universe appears to be fine-tuned. You can make anything seem fine-tuned. The fact that I'm talking to you right now is a miracle. If you just think of all the things that had to happen, so I would be in this room talking to you today, all the things that had to happen in my life, so I would be sitting here right now, the stoplights that if they turned red instead of green, I wouldn't have made in time, all of this incredible conspiracies that had to happen so that I would be here to talk to you. Clearly, it was divinely inspired that I'm here to talk to you, but that's not the case. It just happens to be. You can always make any random series of events look like they're special if you think about it the wrong way.
But what happens is Christian apologists try to blow us away. I mean, when Hugh Ross talks, I swear to God, it's like God talking. It's like it comes down from Mount Sinai. He's so deliberate. And so, but he uses an analogy of, if you stack dimes on the continent of the United States and blew them out, up to the moon and marked one of them, that's the he's used the term 10 to the 35th. That's the probability that the mass density of the universe would be precisely this. And it's not only that, it's the gravitational constant.
That's actually nonsense, of course. I mean, it's nice. It sounds impressive when you say it, but it's not.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's nonsense. It's just nonsense. It turns out that the universe is flat, but it turns out it's not due to the mass density of the universe. It's due to the energy density of empty space. And as I said before, driving a universe to have the combination of energy densities we have happens naturally in a theory called inflation. In fact, a theory called inflation in the early universe, which wasn't designed to try, it was developed because it was the elementary particle physics suggested it was a likely possibility. Inflation, which we now think happened in the early universe, will naturally drive what you would call the energy density universe to be close to this value of m equals 1, generally not to 35 decimal places, but to 35,000 decimal places. And so it's just a natural process. It happens automatically. And the big surprise would be, in some sense, if the universe wasn't exactly flat. And by the way, if it wasn't exactly flat, theorists figured out ways for that to happen, but they were always ugly in my mind. So the fact that it's close to some magic number may in one sense be surprising if you present it incorrectly. But if you realize that the physical process, as I say, the physical process drives that value to be arbitrarily close to 1, just like gravity forces your feet to touch the ground. It's not too surprising that your legs are exactly long enough to touch the ground. But I could say it. I could say if your legs were 1 millimeter longer, then so that your feet ended up below the ground, you wouldn't be able to walk. But of course, that's not the way it works. But I could frame it that way. And so if you try and frame these things, look, the problem, with due respect to James, the problem with Christian apologists or in general is that you presume to know the answer before you ask the question. So the answer is God existed. In the case of Christian apologists, it's a divine God related to Jesus, and therefore everything you see has to be explicable in terms of that fundamental conclusion. Right. Because you know what your answer is, and then you can always try and frame things to find the answer you want. But in general, what we should be doing is not presuming that answer, and asking in an independent way, what is nature telling us? And nature's not giving any evidence of design. The article is called Cosmology Without Design. I just remember the title of it. Not any evidence of design or purpose. That does not mean there's no design or purpose. But if you approach the subject without the presupposition that God exists, and in this case a Christian God exists, if you just ask, what the universe is like, you don't see any evidence of design. Just like if you look at the human body, you don't see any evidence of design. My God, we're poorly designed. It's amazing. If there was a designer, they were pretty crappy. Just like if there was a designer in the universe, pretty crappy. Why would you make a universe where most of the universe is uninhabitable, and most of the universe actually, and not only that, life will end in such a universe. So you could design a universe, you figure, if you're omnipotent, that isn't so unfriendly.
Well, my next question is Stephen Meyer, who's going to be in next month.
Yeah.
Has, I think, his strongest argument, he talks about the inference to the best explanation. And I think his strongest argument is the DNA it's not the chemical makeup of the DNA, like, the ink on a page. It's the order of the nucleotides. And it takes 150 amino acids to make a protein. And these things have got to be in the right order, the adenine, the guanine, and all these nucleotides.
I mean, hold on. They don't have to be in the right order. If they're not in the right order, they don't create those proteins. They create other proteins. So once again, and the example is not a particularly good one, but the example, of course, is monkeys on a typewriter. But the point is that the Earth is old. Okay, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Life explores and every possible niche, and we don't know the origin of life, but we do know that basically the way natural selection works is that chemical reactions that enhance the ability to reproduce are obviously are utilized by those things that reproduce. And so the fact that certain, I mean, life is remarkable. There's no doubt about it. But the fact that DNA sequences produce proteins that allow the remarkable features of life and cells and everything else to work is truly remarkable. But we understand how that can happen, and so since we understand how that can happen without supernatural shenanigans, you can argue that it requires supernatural shenanigans. But I think the attitude you have to have, as Carl Sagan would say, is and he wasn't the first one to say it, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And since one doesn't need it to understand how to evolve diverse and complicated life forms, until proven otherwise, I think the assumption is that it happens naturally. But that's to say, we do not yet understand the earliest life forms and how many people think RNA was a precursor to DNA, but RNA is still incredibly complicated. But there's been a lot of work in the last 10 or 20 years on understanding the earliest life forms and how membranes naturally form lipids, naturally form to exclude and outside. So, it's hard for people in our mere, 10 or whatever you want, in our short lives, to appreciate how long 4.5 billion years is. And now, having said that, the earliest forms of life evolved on Earth within about 500 million years of the formation of the Earth. So they evolved pretty quickly, but still 500 million is a big number. But the earliest life forms, the earliest evidence of fossilized microbes is probably about 500 million years after.
Like the Cambrian Explosion.
Oh wait, no, the Cambrian Explosion is way later. The earliest that was only about 800 million years ago, 700 million years ago. I'm talking 4 billion years ago. If you go to the granite in Canada,
you just have bacteria for 3 billion years.
But, yeah, you do. I bet you didn't have oxygen on Earth till about 1.5 billion years ago.
But one of the ace cards for the Christian apologists is the Cambrian Explosion, because they say all the major phyla suddenly appear without any pre-Cambrian,
well, I mean, there's understandings of exactly what things drive evolutionary explosions, if you wish, or a huge life tends to fill any niche that's available. And for example, one of the clear things around the Cambrian explosion time was that the Earth froze over. The Earth was a solid ball of ice for some time, which undoubtedly caused many life forms to die. But every time, the sad thing about extinctions, which isn't so sad, the good thing about extinctions, not for the things that have become extinct, but for the other things, is that they create lots of niches, and one often finds after extinction an explosion, a radiation of new kinds of exciting life forms. And the fact, of course, is that oxygen was already being created for about 2.5 billion years, and large life forms, ones that, like you and I, need respiration, because photosynthesis can't support the energy necessary to have movings, and also need skeletons. And so life had to learn the process of respiration, which releases about 40 times more energy for each ATP molecule that exists. Now, I should say all of this, by the way, James, I hope you're not getting upset. Most of this is in my book, Atom, which is a story of an atom from the beginning of the universe to the end. Isn't in a universe or nothing, but I don't mind talking about it. Anyway.
One other thing before I leave. What's frustrating to me is when I watched Peter Atkins debate Hugh Ross, and I watched the BioLogos people, is they don't know theology. Richard Dawkins, we just read his latest book, and he made rookie mistakes in Christianity history. Just something that basic. And like, give an example, like Noah's flood. I was listening to someone the other day, and it's like I felt like screaming. You know that this narrative is a blended narrative with the P writer, the J writer, 400 years apart. It's two different writers. That's why you have two animals entering the ark, and then the J writer has 7. You have one 40-day story.
But the fact that there are many writers is only, I mean, what let me channel Richard. He would argue, and as I would, I'd say, I mean, it's obviously a further example that man created God rather than the other way around. people wrote some people, and lots of different people wrote stories that eventually got amalgamated into what we now call the Bible. And the fact that they're inconsistent with one another in certain cases is clear evidence that different people wrote them, but it's also clear evidence that the claims that were made in either one are at least suspect. So
well, and it's sad that people like Ken Ham are wasting resources building this crazy Noah's Ark thing.
Making a lot of
money. And right here in Dallas, by the way, Lawrence, we have ICR, the 6,000 year guys, with their little creation museum.
I know, I've been to the creation museum, and I mean, that's even sadder. On the other hand, I've debated Ken Ham. I've spent time with him. Once I debated him on actually Bill O'Reilly many, many years ago, the same day the creation museum opened. And in some sense, I don't mind him so much because what he says is absolutely true, it seems to me. He says, or at least it's understandable. He says, look, if any of the fundamental claims of the Bible are wrong, then the whole thing is suspect for me. And I would agree with him. But his line is, therefore, none of them could be wrong. Because my line is, they're wrong, and therefore the whole thing is suspect. So it's just two different reflections of the same thing. But at least I can respect his understanding that if part of the Bible is clearly suspect, then you have to be suspicious about the rest.
Well, yeah, and they're wrong if it's Hugh Ross older or Ken Ham younger. Either way has its problems, because the young Earth, you're locked into a 6,000 year box. Old Earth, you have things like the plants coming before the sea creatures, and you just have problems all over the place.
I mean, you got to remember the Bible was written by people who didn't know the Earth orbited the sun. And so it's not too surprising to find that they didn't
remember your quote.
The...
And see, Hugh Ross will say, "Oh, well, the Bible says it stretched out the heavens like a tent," and it's like, "Oh my gosh, the Bible predicted the Big Bang." And Peter Atkins goes, "No, they didn't." I mean,
I get emails all the time from Islamic people who tell me that the Quran, give me examples of how the Quran has predicted everything. The Quran, by the way, which also said the moon split in two at some point. So the point is, you can read, and we all do. In any book, and in my book, getting back to my book, you can read anything you want into things that are sufficiently vague, and so I can say, it's sunny today, and say, oh well, that really meant that it's really the sun is anyway. You can read whatever you want,
right?
So anyway,
let me let the rest. Thanks a lot, Lawrence. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean Bill. No, I meant Ken Ham. And by the way, I was there the day it opened. I was right in front of the museum, and I was the main speaker, and then they weren't gonna. And I was actually a commentator for NPR and had credentials, so I could tour the museum. And I went to try and tour it, and they knew me right away. And they said, "Dr. Krauss, your credentials didn't arrive. You can't tour it." So I said, "That's a shame, but I happen to have a BBC film crew and a PBS film crew here. Do you mind if they show me not being allowed in?" And they said, "Oh, come on in." And I got a tour by then. And then I had to fly to New York the same day to debate Ken Ham that night. And anyway,
Dr. Krauss, I have a question for you. That's just to get into your book, and we can expand on this. And so you talk about the physics, which obviously very knowledgeable about that. And I agree with James. When I read A Universe from Nothing, and I read The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far, you have a talent for writing and telling complicated things in a very conventional way. So I like your writing style. May not agree with everything, of course, but it brings you into the conversation, which is, I think, is what you're trying to do. What we're trying to do is bring the heavens down to earth and make it understandable for everybody. So I applaud you on that. My question basically would be, if you have a physical description of the universe, which is what you're attempting to do, is to give us a physical picture of the physics in cosmology and all that stuff. Can you make a distinction between a physical explanation, let's say, like I can explain how I made coffee, I can explain all the technical details about how I make coffee. Do you think that just having a purely physical description wouldn't rule out my role in making coffee, right? So we could have all the physical
absolutely. I've always said that. No, absolutely. One can never. I've said it before. The fact that there's no evidence for purpose does not mean that there isn't. It's just there's no evidence, and so it doesn't rule out back in the old days when I used to actually be more, well, I wasn't thought of as a well-known atheist, I guess. I used to make a big point of saying, and it's still true, that science cannot rule out and can never rule out the existence of God. Can never disprove the existence of God. I mean, I can't, as I like to point out now, I can't, and I may have said in the book, I cannot prove that we were here 2 minutes ago. I cannot prove that I just had that discussion. I can't prove that we were all created 10 seconds ago with the memories of that discussion implanted in our minds. Okay, so but I can ask, is it likely? And and then I can say, well, if that's the case, then I just won't do science. I mean, there's no, if everything I see is an illusion, then what's the point of doing it? So I think that what is really important to point out is that not that science can't disprove the existence of God, which is a true statement. What I think you have to point out is that basically the major tenets of all the world's religions, and not just Christianity, the details, when they have to do with the physical world, are inconsistent with what we now know about science. Now, so that means that there can be a God, but the scriptures of all the world's major religions are full of things that are just wrong. That's all.
Okay.
Hey, Lawrence, I want to say that I'm not offended. One of the things I recognize as a Christian that I have, my biases, cognitive biases, and
As do I.
so, but I would suspect that it's not just Christians that may suffer from that.
Well, no,
So
I
one of
think
the
we
reasons
all
that we have
do.
the book club is so that we can, interact with those kind of things and spend
Sure.
a lot of time trying to hear people I don't agree with and listen to them and, take them seriously. And of course, the atheists that are in here, they spend hours and hours reading the Christian books and interacting with us on that. We
Yeah, I
appreciate
think,
that
and
as
both
well.
groups are probably, look, we all have our biases and preconceptions, absolutely, and people like yourself are honestly want to try and confront your beliefs with with the evidence of what we know. You come from and you do it, of course, from a viewpoint. Hey, I have my relationship with God, my personal relationship with Jesus, or whatever, and I need to understand how what we now know about the universe is consistent with that relationship. And so I understand that, but that's what you're coming from. You have that relationship, and you want to try honestly to understand the complexity of what we know and how to address confusing things in a way that's consistent with what you deeply believe. And I understand that, and I do have biases, and there's no doubt that I have a bias. Which I don't think it affects my research. I do. I have a bias that. First of all, I don't like the word belief, so I try not to believe in anything. Things are likely or unlikely. That's my view about things. Things are unlikely or likely. That's the way it is in science. So when everyone says, "Do you believe in young Earth?" Or do you believe in black holes or whatever? I just don't believe in anything. The question is, what's the evidence of nature telling me? But it is true that if I had my druthers, I'd rather live in a universe without a God.
Yeah, and I think somebody had that in the questions as well. As what is your preference? If what are you hoping that the outcome of that question would be? And obviously, I think Christians are hoping that the evidence points to what we already believe.
Yeah.
But I think that's true of atheists as well, probably, or a lot of them.
Well, it depends.
One of the questions I usually ask, try to get to know new members of our club that are atheists, is if you had sufficient proof that Christianity was true, would you be willing to worship Jesus? And I've gotten all kinds of different answers from that, but primarily I get the answer, no, I wouldn't.
I know. I've been asked that question. If you've watched one of my numerous debates with William Lane Craig, who gave the most awful answer to the alternative, I was really disappointed in him for that one, because they asked. It was not the hosts were awful in all of them. It was in Australia, but the question was, what, Dr. Russ, what would it take for you to believe? And I gave an answer, which I'll give you now. And Craig, they asked him what it would take you to not believe. And he said the silliest thing. He said, if my daughter died. And I thought, wow, that's pretty fragile belief then. I mean, if that's all it takes. But in my case, sure, I think what I said, I said, if tonight the stars lined up when I looked up there and said, I am here, in Aramaic or Hebrew or English or whatever language the divine creator chose to do, I would be highly suspicious that there was something out there. So, I would be, I frankly would be, I like to be wrong. So that's why I'm a scientist. So while I would prefer to live in a universe that didn't have a divine being pulling all the strings, I would be fascinated and I would be titillated to discover evidence that such a thing existed. It would be fascinating to me. And
so if your belief system was falsifiable, that would be something that you would welcome.
Yeah, because the whole point of science is to falsify beliefs in a sense, or preconceptions, and to be wrong is a lovely thing. And as I told Stephen Colbert on his program when he interviewed me about a universe of nothing, I said being wrong is great. You should try it sometime. But that's back when he had the fake persona, the Colbert Report. And it was a lovely, and he was a great interview. And by the way, I
did want to, before I forget, let everybody know that we were an hour off on the invitation because you're on the far, far East Coast, not the East Coast of the United States, but the East Coast of Canada. So you're in Atlantic time. So you are probably going to have to leave early. So I wanted to warn people we're trying to kind of speed things up.
It's 9:45 here. Yeah.
Right. So let me do this. Ken Daniels is one of our longtime, close to a charter member of the club, and he is a former Christian who is a non-believer, and he has a question for you. Ken, can you unmute?
Thanks, James, and thanks, Dr. Krauss, for being here. It's a real treat. I wish we had somebody like you every time here. But anyway, I do have a question that came to mind as I was going through your book. I don't pretend to understand a lot of what you're describing, but it's very fascinating. And I got little bits and pieces, especially the idea that there's zero total energy in the universe. That kind of makes sense from a naturalistic perspective. Yeah. But the question I want to ask is, if we imagine the shape of the galaxies was set in stone by primordial events that followed the Big Bang, to what extent was everything else set in stone? If the exact same Big Bang, and I do mean the exact same Big Bang, were to occur again, would I exist again, complete with an ingrown toenail that I had surgically removed when I was 20? Or would there be truly random events along the way that would make the tape unspool differently?
Well, the answer is that it isn't set in stone. It's probabilistic. At a very fundamental level, the fluctuations that appear to be responsible for the formation of galaxies arose from quantum mechanics, which means that they're random Gaussian fluctuations. So quantum mechanics at the fundamental level, the world is energy and particles are fluctuating, and so the formation of galaxies existed in regions which were statistically above the mean, where there is more density above the mean on average, and that they're statistically distributed, and so there is not. There's not. When the Big Bang, as matter evolved in the Big Bang, it wasn't. There was no precondition that said there will be a given number of galaxies, or that there will be a distribution. That they will exist exactly as they are. What you could say is, given the primordial fluctuations, we would expect that there might be a distribution of galaxies, and on average, you might expect this many to form, and there'll be regions where there are a lot more, and there'll be regions where there are a lot less. So it's all probabilistic, and so nothing's set in stone. On the other hand, if to make you either happy or sad, and I don't really care which one, if the universe is infinite in time, not just space, we don't know if it's infinite either. Namely, if the universe goes on forever, and it could be an infinite space too, we just don't know. Then you will imagine, and it's a famous kind of, not necessarily paradox, but it's a famous bit of playing around, infinity is really very different than very long, as Woody Allen would say, that eternity is a long time, especially near the end, and that means, so if it's infinite, then everything that's ever happened happens again infinite number of times, and infinite number of times the same way, and an infinite number of times a different way. And there have been an infinite number of evolutions of life in which I'm asking you the question you ask me, or in which you ask the question with one word different. Or so if you have infinity, then and that's the problem of infinity. Basically, anything's possible. So if you like to think that your toenail might get ingrown again somewhere in the future, that could be possible if the universe is infinite in time or space.
It's a little bit depressing to think about that I would have to go through all the travails of life again, but I guess there would be no continuity between.
There'd be no continuity.
Me and my
Some would be exactly the same. They wouldn't be you, but they'd be an exact copy of you, or a slightly different copy. As I say, on the other hand, you can think of that as a depressing thing, but just think of it as you can turn it around like anything and make it quite optimistic. Say that, well, okay, yeah, but just think of all those opportunities you missed. The person you wish you'd talked to in a bus and you never did. Well, and then if you wait long enough, it's going to happen where you do anyway.
Well, and you can imagine that there are some universes where life and existence is even more horrific than it is for the most horrific experiences that people experience on this earth.
Yeah. Well, and they're also, as we tend to think now, and I talked about in the book, the reasonable hypothesis is that our universe isn't unique, that there are many universes. And it could be that in most universes, life doesn't arise at all. So that, that's even worse. Maybe. But, or there are universes where life evolves, but the universe starts to collapse. There's lots of ways the universe can destroy life, not just a star exploding. And as I told you, the universe is trying to kill us every day. It's amazing that life has existed for this long on Earth. We happen to be living in a relatively quiescent corner of a relatively quiet galaxy that's far away from others, but there are lots of ways that the universe is trying to kill us, and eventually it will.
Yeah, thanks there. I appreciate that, Lawrence. Phil Bear has a question for you about exactly what is or is not nothing. So, Phil, if you could unmute and you knew that one was coming, didn't you?
Well, yeah. I spent a lot of time. People seem to have a problem with that, but go on. Yeah.
Can I call you Lawrence?
Hi.
Can I call you Lawrence?
Yeah, you can call me whatever you want.
Sweet.
Just not late for dinner. Okay.
So when I read your book, it really seemed to me that one of the central themes of the book was that the universe I think that you were indicating that you thought the universe did have a beginning, and that beginning came out of nothing, and that nothing was. Pardon me?
Our universe, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I read some of your comments about what the word nothing really means.
Which I tried to actually define. Most people who criticize actually don't define nothing. But anyway, go on.
Well, I think I would like you to maybe expand on that, because I have to apologize. Even after reading your book, I still don't really know what you mean by nothing, because this is the observation that I have, and it's not about you. It's about several cosmologists and theoretical physicists. What the observation I have is that whenever you say that the universe popped into existence out of nothing, what you start with and what they start with is never nothing. It's always something. And so what I want to know is if the universe started from quantum fluctuations or whatever, whatever it is, I'm not, that may be a bad example, but if that's what it came, if that's where it came from, then where did the something come from that the universe came from.
Well, let me deconvolve that. It's a good question, and people, and some people. One guy, and I noticed one of your listeners asked about David Albert's critique. He obviously didn't read the book, but because now I hear all these people say, "Well, Lawrence Krauss talked about a quantum vacuum, not nothing," and I don't think I mentioned the word quantum vacuum once in the book. Maybe I did, but I don't think I did.
Quantum fluctuation is what is it?
Well, yeah, but here's the deal. And let me cut through a lot of the stuff that I've spent years on and since the book. I talk about the different kinds of nothing, and I try to do it pretty carefully in the book. But here's the point. Everything we now see, all of space, all of time, all of the galaxies, all the matter, all the radiation, everything that makes up our universe did not exist. And then it existed. Now, was there anything else at the time our universe suddenly came into existence? Maybe, but I don't really care. Because what I'm talking about is that a universe from nothing means no universe, and then a universe. Now, were there other universes? Maybe that kind of multiverse is eternal. Maybe that's metaphysics. But what's really the question, which I think is really the important question, although then people try and turn it around, the really important question is that, and the question I think is really at the basis of some of the religious demands of God, is how can you create a universe full of galaxies and planets and stars, and if there weren't any of that to begin with, surely you need something supernatural to make that out of nothing. And my point is that you don't need that at all. Our space, our time, everything we exist in need not have existed. And then space-time can suddenly pop into existence. Space and time, by the way, not just space, but space and time. So there was no time before that. And by the way, that means that itself is an oxymoron, because you can't. There's no before. And that's a real problem for people. It's that, cause and effect is, and the people like Craig likes to talk about whatever that Kalam hypothesis. But the point is, if there's no before, there is no cause. Just like. Let me give you an example that I think I don't think I've used in the book, but I probably use in discussions. This lamp next to me, or those here. Okay, let's do this. Okay, now I turn on my podcast lights. Okay, now what happens? The photons that are illuminating me now didn't exist before I turned it on. Didn't exist at all. They were emitted by atoms, but they weren't inside of the atoms. They did not exist, and they were emitted, by the way, spontaneously. So you couldn't predict each one happening. It was you could say statistically, I expect a certain amount of energy to be emitted when I pump a certain amount of energy through these lights and through the gas or whatever it is in these lights in my, and so the question I'm going to say is if our universe is a photon. It didn't exist, and it came into existence. Now, you may say, aha, but an atom existed. But I don't really care about the atom. The atom isn't our universe. Our universe is everything that we see and experience, including all the matter and radiation. Is it possible for that to be created spontaneously when it didn't exist before? And the answer is yes. Now, the rest is just semantics. So you might say, but that's not nothing. And I'm saying, okay, fine. Okay, but I don't know. The point is that we don't know. Maybe it arose spontaneously in a multiverse of bubbling, boiling brew of universes that are spontaneously being created and some that are being destroyed. Maybe it's all there is. But what is possible, given what we think we know about quantum gravity, is that space-times are being created spontaneously all the time, and some of them can evolve into universes under certain conditions that will last for 14 billion years and have galaxies and life. And if you asked, what would be the characteristic of a universe that formed spontaneously from no universe by just an extrapolation of the known laws of physics, what would the characteristics of a universe that was 14 billion years old be if that were the case? They'd be precisely the characteristics of the universe we measure to be, which is new. We didn't presume that in advance or even predict it. But if you actually look and see all the wonderful things that we've discovered by the universe, which I try and talk about in the book, and ask, what would be the characteristics of a universe that did evolve spontaneously where there was no universe? So everything came into existence spontaneously. It wasn't existing, then it was existing. It would look just like the universe we live in. Now, that's not proof that happened, but I find that highly suggestive. And that's what I mean by universe from nothing. I'm not asking what else existed. I'm asking, did our universe exist? And before it existed, it wasn't there, and I would call that nothing. If you don't like that, I'm fine with that. And you say, okay, it's not my idea of nothing. I'm not presuming this stuff that isn't our universe. I'm not presuming that there isn't other stuff that isn't our universe that may have preexisted if there was a global quantity called time that did exist. None of which is necessarily the case, because as I say, in our universe, our time began when our universe began. There was no time before that, literally.
So,
okay,
so
wrap it up, Phil, if you can, because we got
sure.
a list there.
So
I'll go a little longer, don't worry. Mm-hmm.
If the universe didn't exist and then it did exist, so my question is, do you think that there was a cause for that to happen?
Well, I'm telling you that the whole idea of cause and effect goes out the window if time begins. How do you talk about cause? Cause necessarily precedes effect. But if time begins, there's no before. Cause always happens before effect. So if the universe spontaneously began that way, we have to redefine all the ways we think about things. And it's not as if physics has come to grips with that question. But if time began, there was no before. And just like there's no cause of the photon that's emitted by the atom, there's no cause of it. It's spontaneously emitted. But in that case, there was a time before, so you can argue, I turned on the lights and that was the cause. But in the case of a universe forming spontaneously, time begins, and the whole notion of cause and effect, which is fundamental to the way we classically think about logic and the universe, goes out the window. Now, you may not like that, and I may not like it, but the universe doesn't care what we like. If it's true, we have to think of a new way to think about framing physics and giving up the notion of cause and effect when it comes to the origin of the universe itself.
Well, I would suggest that there's such a thing as a logical prior, even if there's no such thing as a temporal prior to the beginning of time. So, but I like the fact that that you recognize, and a lot of people don't recognize this, and that is that prior to the beginning of time, you have to rethink your whole idea of what you mean by the word before.
Yeah, when you say prior, as I say, a prior just may not make sense. It may not be a good question, as Richard Dawkins said, I think, in the afterword of my book. It may be like asking what's the color of jealousy, although we know it's green. But so I don't think it was such a good example of his. But so these questions may not be good questions, and that's just the case. We don't know, but they just may not be good questions. They may not make physical sense when we understand the physics. And when you say a logical prior, you have to understand what we mean by logic. And when it comes to quantum mechanics, classical logic goes out the window. Classical logic says that an electron can't be in two places at once, but it is. Classical logic says an electron can be spinning up and sideways at the same time, but it is before we measure it. So the whole notion of logic, when people talk about logic, I again worry, because logic is based, especially Aristotelian logic, is based on a whole bunch of classical presumptions, which we know the universe need not obey. So it becomes much more complicated.
It is written, nothing from nothing leaves nothing. I think that's
that's written, but it's wrong.
It's actually a song. I was just kidding.
I know.
But would you?
I like my favorite line from Lawrence of Arabia is where he saves that guy from the desert, and he comes back and he says nothing is written. And I remember I saw that when I was a kid, when I was 10 or 11, and I'll admit that had a huge impact on me.
So would you agree that the photons did have an intelligent cause that hit your
No.
face? No.
Well, these photons,
Yes.
in a very indirect way, if you mean by pressing the button. But
that was supposed to be a joke too.
Oh, okay,
So-
sorry.
Intelligent cause.
Here I am a jokester, and I'm taking you seriously. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, I'm just, Mike Cahill, I think, has a question for you. He's a longtime club member. Mike, can you unmute?
Sure. I appreciate reading your book very much, especially as somebody who's studied a bit of physics and astronomy, especially the kind of how we got to here from there. And I had 3 questions. I'm going to try and ask one which I'm hoping will get the briefest answers from you of all my questions. And that is, toward the end of the book, and tonight actually too, you invoke the multiverse quite a lot. And it seems like in the book, at least, maybe not in person, but in the book, it's like there's a lot of unanswered questions we have, but the multiverse could answer, the whole concept of the multiverse could deal with a lot of those. So my question is, how is the different than the God of the gaps issue there, that if we don't understand it, God did it? So if we don't understand it, the multiverse did it. So how is that a different question?
Well, it's a good question. There is a difference between the multiverse and God, in the sense
I know that.
No, but I mean, the point is that we've been driven. Most physicists, myself included, for the most part, hated the idea of a multiverse, because most of us grew up being physicists saying we want to explain why the universe has to be the way it is, not why it's generally very different. and so, but we've been driven to the multiverse, kicking and screaming, because that's where our fundamental understanding of fundamental particle physics is driving us. It had nothing to do with cosmology. It had nothing to do with the fact that it ultimately could address some of these questions. It had to do with fundamental questions of elementary particle physics. So it was a corollary, not a premise. And I think that's really important. So we didn't invent the multiverse saying, let's try and solve these cosmological problems. We're driven to it by fundamental physics questions. And as I said, driven to it kicking and screaming. Now, it's true that, but there's another profound difference. In some sense, we can actually test the idea of a multiverse. And I've talked about not in the book, because I don't think I knew about it then, but I've written papers about it since then. So that in some sense, we can probe that idea. And that's what makes it science, and not just mere metaphysics. But so it's I think the difference between a multiverse and God is that God was created to try and address these fundamental quandaries humans had about themselves and their world they were living in, and good and evil and all sorts of things. And it was addressed to God was invented to address and try and answer those questions, or at least appease people's concerns. Multiverse was not developed that way. It arose totally differently, having to do with questions that none of the questions that you're asking today relate to, having to do with the nature of primordial inflation, or in some case string theory, and so I think it's very different. Except in my mind, you could say, well, it's call the multiverse God if you want, but I mean, there's no intelligence. The difference is that it makes physical sense, whereas God doesn't to me. I saw someone see someone saying, does Krauss have no idea the concept of God? What? I'm sorry, what?
I think anthropologically you kind of missed the point of did they invent God or whatever like that. But that's so do you said you don't believe anything right now, so I hesitate to ask if you believe in the multiverse, but you said if
agnostic, like everything else.
Yeah, posit it, and yeah, well, maybe the evidence will point that way, and maybe it'll point a little different in 50 years. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, look, I want to find out. I'd love to learn. I'd love to learn the answer to that question, and then there'll be more questions. Yeah. It depends on the day. Some days I don't want there to be a multiverse. Some days I do, but it doesn't really matter what I want. That's what I realize.
Yeah, I think I love that quote in your book, that the truth doesn't depend on what we want to happen or what is just there or not. And that's, I think everybody in this group would agree with that one.
I hope so.
I guess,
Yeah, I mean, I
yeah,
hope
well,
it's
that's
a good
what
start.
we're here.
Not everyone agrees with it, but it's a good start. I mean, we've had leaders of our country who don't believe in that, but I think you're absolutely right. The point is that reality is, in fact, one of my favorite lines from one of my favorite science fiction writers was said, "Reality is that which continues to exist even when you stop believing in it."
So do you think that we're going to ever get direct evidence of multiverse?
I proposed one way we might, having to do with gravitational waves from the early universe, that might give us evidence that the multiverse had to exist. And so that's one way we might. Obviously, in the multiverse.
That hasn't been done yet, right?
No, and I should say it in the case of multiverses, and there are many different kinds of multiverses, but the ones you're talking about are ones that are causally disconnected. So we'll never be able to detect if there's universes that are causally disconnected. We won't be able to ever. That's the definition of causally disconnected. You can't communicate. You can't do any evidence. But what we can do is test the idea of that would lead to the formation of multiple universes. So we can test that in the early universe, the theory that is correct, that would inevitably produce many universes. We can test that idea in principle, not yet in practice. But if we can measure primordial gravitational waves from inflation, as my colleague Frank Wilczek and I showed in a paper, and Frank won the Nobel Prize in Physics for what that was worth. But as we showed, that will give you a direct evidence of the existence of multiverses.
Yeah.
I mean, indirect. I mean, not direct. Indirect evidence of the existence of multiverses. What?
If you're invoking Nobel Prizes, I think it's interesting that several Nobel Prize physics prizes winners have been Christians too. So
sure. Some Republicans are some. I like to say some scientists are Republicans, so there's no accounting for taste. I know. I figure if I can't offend people about God, I can do it from politics. But I mean, what I'm saying is that, of course, look, I have many colleagues or friends who are scientists who are religious, and some Nobel Prize winners who I've known very well are religious. But let's make it clear. They didn't turn out to be, they weren't Muslims. They were Christian. It was interesting that their parents were Christian and they grew up in a Christian household. It's not too surprising they grew up being Christian. And so I think that one has to say that that the fact that they're Christian is as ingrained in them as maybe their political beliefs or their beliefs about what's good or bad or other things comes from their family upbringing as much as, and it's really hard to overcome what you learn as a child, which is, again, and both Richard and I have said this, and I don't mean this in a mean way, but I do think in a very vague way that bringing up children in a religious, in an organized religion early on is sort of child abuse, because notions of God and divinity and these questions we're talking about now are incredibly deep and incredibly complex, and as you see, we'd have no good answers. But to take a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old and tell them that this is the case, well, it's too. They don't have the ability to digest that in an intellectual way, and it becomes part of their being in a way that's very hard to get rid of. So I think even if we are Christians, I think it would be fair to wait till a child is old enough to be able to assess these issues before you try and indoctrinate them. But anyway, that's
can I ask how you?
Well, let's go ahead and do this. Appreciate the question, Mike, and I think he was raised Jewish and but not religious, if I remember.
Well, no, I was bar mitzvahed. I was raised Jewish, and I'm sure I like to believe the miracles for a while when I was younger, and I didn't have an epiphany. It wasn't some some revelation. And I saw someone use that word. It was just a matter of saying, hey, let me learn about. As the more I learn about the world, these stories seem to me to be clearly fairy tales, and I just become less interested. And I became more interested in the real world of science as I learned about it, or the real world around me. Not just science, but history and art and literature, and so it just the Old Testament stories clearly just sort of waned. But I was young. I wanted to believe. We all want to believe, like Fox Mulder, and so. And yeah, I was, I did the high holidays, and And I was bar mitzvahed, although that was enough to turn me off religion. That whole
you didn't look at your religious upbringing from your parents as being child abuse at the time, but
well, there was. I mean, they were. I mean, well, no, of course I didn't. But I didn't. I mean, if I'd been told about Santa Claus, which at that time I wasn't, I really wanted to believe in Santa Claus too, because darn it, all these other people were getting gifts, and so. I wouldn't have been upset with them if they told me about Santa Claus and then I learned it was wrong. It's, I still love, we celebrate Christmas and because I love gift giving and getting and I like all the lights and I like all the stuff. I'll celebrate anything as long as God isn't involved.
Well, Lawrence, thanks for the answer, Mike. Great questions. We do have another person up next. I think it's Tim Birch. Tim, if you wouldn't mind unmuting and asking your question of Lawrence.
While I'm waiting, I can see Susan Landro's question, but does Krauss have no idea of the concept of God outside time or our time? Of course, you need God to be outside our time and out of time. Fine. Yeah, great. Invent that. That's fine, but it doesn't answer any questions for me. Anyway.
Yes. Brady, who would be next?
That'd be Stephen Hoyt, I believe.
Basically, if God is outside of our epistemic reach, then the question is, what would ground either atheism or theism itself, given that we can't talk about evidence to say there's evidence lacking, which would ground atheism, and obviously it wouldn't ground theism either.
Well, I wrote a foreword for a book, which is not this book, but it's probably relevant because which was written a long time ago about the case called The Case for Atheism. And I had never thought of it this way till I read the book. It was an old book, and they asked me to write a new foreword. When I realized that, people like to define themselves as agnostic or atheistic, or obviously religious. But everyone who calls themselves an agnostic is an atheist. Because atheism is just a statement saying that I'm not convinced by the evidence. I'm not convinced enough by the evidence to believe in God. And it doesn't do it for me. So I therefore, quote unquote, don't believe in God. Now, there's different versions. There's a whole spectrum of people who deny the existence of God, who defend. But agnosticism is just saying, look, the data didn't do it for me. And so I'm on the fence, but it doesn't. But there's not enough data to convince me that there's any basis for God. And so, if you're saying, the lack of evidence, you can choose the lack. For me, I'm a hard-nosed scientist. So if you can't test it.
Yeah, the problem is more fundamental than that. We can't say what evidence would be. So agnosticism itself doesn't make sense, nor atheism, nor theism.
I think we can say maybe I'm limited here, but I would say most people would say the evidence would be something that defies the natural law, something supernatural is required in any kind. You need a God like Susan's God who's outside of time or outside of space, and you need something beyond the laws of physics. Now, if you can say, look, the laws of nature are proof for me that's God because there's order and there's beauty, and you can have a Spinoza type of God and I say, fine, if you want to use the word God for that, it makes you happy, fine. But to have an intelligence that's directing things, you need to have something that literally evidence of them directing things, which requires you, I think, to go outside the laws of physics. So you need something that is inexplicable, not just something that's not understood. One of the other memes that people seem to like from what I said is that lack of understanding is not evidence for God, it's evidence for lack of understanding. And so, but it may be my limited framework, and I'm willing to accept that. But to me, evidence for God would require some evidence that the laws of nature have to be violated at some level, that something is pulling the strings. Maybe you don't need that, and I'm not going to argue about that question.
Well, thanks for that too. And I think coming up next is Mark. I may be saying the name wrong. Andreses, I think it is. Mark. And first, let us know if you are if you're new to the club, and then also if you would unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, this
Dr.
is
Krauss, before I didn't want to. I just wanted to throw out the time issue. I didn't know how much longer.
Don't worry, I'll tell you when I'm running out of time. It's okay.
Okay.
I've been verbose at certain times, so I feel it's like a soccer game. You have to give some extra minutes there at the end. Okay.
All right, cool. I just wanted to check.
Thanks, my name is. Yeah, this is Mark Andrisi. This is my first time with the group.
I like your dog, Donald. Okay.
I wanted to just real quick thank Daniel Ray for inviting me to join.
My dog is here too.
So my question, I had a couple of questions, but I think you answered my first one regarding the cause, and you had kind of mentioned the calam, and I'm going to skip that one for now.
Good, thank you.
My next question is more the conceptualization of what the universe is expanding into. So the universe is expanding. So there's some kind of space outside of space that the universe is expanding into. It's it's very hard to conceptualize.
It is very hard to conceptualize, but it's a great question because I hear it a lot, and it's one of the biggest misconceptions of the expanding universe. A universe that's expanding doesn't have to be expanding into anything. Now, I'll give you two examples, some of which one of which I think I use in the book at least, but maybe both. Often the example that's used for an expanding universe is a surface of a balloon, where I even in lectures I've used it. You put on the galaxies and you blow it up, and the galaxies are moving apart. You say, but look, the balloon is expanding into the room. But now I say, no, that's true for the balloon. But let's say the surface of the balloon is a two-dimensional universe. The surface of the balloon is all there is. There's no space inside or outside. What's happening is the distance between the galaxies is increasing everywhere, and nowhere is any galaxy approaching any other galaxy. The universe is just expanding. That surface is just expanding. If you don't like that, the other example that I use, because there are different examples appeal to different people, 1,000 points of light. It's much easier to understand this question than take an infinite universe, an infinite rubber bed sheet. You got an infinite rubber bed sheet. It's huge, okay, king size and beyond. Okay, it's huge. Take that infinite rubber bed sheet and stretch it. Okay, so the point is that space can expand without expanding into anything, and indeed, that's what's happening in our universe. It's expanding, but there's no outside. Especially if it's a closed universe, it's like a sphere. There's no outside. It's just this. It's like the surface of a balloon. There's no outside. There's no inside. There isn't an extra dimension for it to expand into. So while it defeats our common sense because we think of expansion in that sense, it doesn't have to be that. That's just a feature of common sense that's wrong. That you don't have to expand into anything. And so it's not as if our universe is inside of anything else or need be inside of anything else.
So it's not so much that we have no idea what's outside. It's more that it is possible, and we're conceptualizing it as though there isn't anything outside, that everything is within the universe itself.
Well, the mathematics describes just the space and time that we exist in, and it doesn't. Not only it says there are no edges. I mean, that we'd be able to measure them, and it in particular, so it doesn't preclude. Well, here's an example. In string theory, which generically has many more dimensions than 4 dimensions or 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time, our whole universe can be a 4-dimensional slice of an 11-dimensional space. And then, if you want to think in 11 dimensions, there can be other universes, a millimeter away in other dimensions outside of our universe, if you want to think of it that way. So that's one possibility by adding extra dimensions. But in just 4 dimensions, it also the other important thing, which I do think I talked about in the book, which is really a fundamental change in our language, and some people seem to hate change in language. They don't like that what we mean by nothing now is not what was meant by nothing 40 years ago. And what I like to say is that changing definitions like that are an example of learning, so that's okay. But that joke made me distracted for a second. But
It's okay.
No. It's a really, there's an important point I wanted to make there. Now I've forgotten it. I'm sorry. I'll remember it in a second. But anyway, the changing. The changed definition of universe. When I was young, the universe meant everything. It was synonymous with everything. But that's not what it means anymore. We now think of the universe as that region of space with which we could have one day have received communication from in the past and could one day communicate with in the future, even if the time is infinite. So space is the locus of points that can have affected us and to which we can have some effect upon. Okay? But that means that there can be outsides of our universe, right? In fact, it really means that our universe is inside of what's called a horizon. The horizon is the region that we can have been impacted by or impact upon. The question is, will that horizon grow, eventually becoming infinitely big or not? But in that picture, our universe, there can definitely be an outside of our universe. There can be causally disconnected regions that we can never interact with. And that's an operational definition that's much more meaningful and useful than saying everything. It's that region of space that which we basically could have communicated with or will one day be able to communicate with. And so that in that sense, there can always be an outside.
So a multiverse, other universes would technically be outside of our universe.
Outside in that sense, in the sense that we can never causally connect with them. But but we're not expanding into them either. In fact, they're expanding and we're expanding, but we're still getting farther apart. Right. It's really even weirder.
Very weird. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I think we have thanks for that question and answer, both of you guys. And I think we have coming up next Eric Hernandez. I think, Eric, would you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Wondering if you could comment on Dr. Albert's critique of your book, because you were talking about something about the quantum fluctuation and particles coming in and out. But it kind of seems like almost saying getting an aggregate from nothing or getting babies from non-babies. Where there are no babies, you can get a baby. But it seems, I want to say it respectfully, but basically how would you comment on his critiques?
Well, I think it's not a critique of the book. I'm really not sure he really read the book, or at least carefully read it. And his was the reason that all these people talk about quantum vacuum. I'm not talking about a quantum vacuum. I'm not talking about pre-existence. I'm talking about, once again, did space and time and everything we see exist, not exist, and then come into existence? Now, the question of if anything existed before or in a larger scale is not the question that I'm addressing. So his concerns about I even point out that the laws, I even say, well, yes, I'm using laws of quantum mechanics to understand how a universe can pop in nothing. So that presumes those laws exist. But in my last definition of nothing, I point out that maybe the laws of quantum mechanics arose at the same, since the forces that in each universe that arises in a multiverse, the laws of physics can be quite different. Maybe quantum mechanics is unique to our universe and spontaneously arose when the rest of the universe did. We don't know the answer to that question because we don't know what happened at t=0. So arguing that our universe arose out of a quantum vacuum allowed a whole bunch of people who never read the book and never even thought about this issue to suddenly say, oh, but Lawrence Krauss isn't talking about nothing. The question is, did our space and time not exist and then exist? And to me, that's the question that people are trying to answer when they ask whether the universe came from nothing. And so,
could I rephrase?
What was that?
I was saying, could I rephrase the question? Maybe I didn't.
Sure.
So his critique, or what he said specifically in his critique, was that what you were saying was akin to showing that a rearrangement of one's fingers can pop fists into existence. Would that be analogous to what you were saying?
No. I mean, yes and no. My point was, and this is what he's a philosopher, by the way, many philosophers don't like, is that what we're really learning in physics is that the distinction between something and nothing is not a very strong distinction. And that that something can come, so yeah, you can say that a fist, if you want to think of a fingers as nothing and a fist as something. The point is, what physics has told us is that what many people thought was nothing, and the different versions, like empty space, is not empty. It's full of a boiling, bubbling brew of virtual particles. And so we're learning that not only is it, that non-existence will inevitably, in the case of quantum mechanics, produce existence. And so that distinction between nothing and something that some people think is so essential is really not, from a fundamental physics perspective, so essential. That, namely, if you have non-existence, particles will pop out. If those particles didn't exist, they will pop into existence inevitably if you have a universe that's old enough. Similarly, if space and time are quantized, space-times will inevitably pop into existence. And the rest is just philosophical mumbo jumbo. If you talk about, well, okay, that's the same as a fist and a hand. You can, the question I think all of us, including religious people, are asking is, how was our universe created? That means everything we see, everything we live in, the space and time we live in, and in the biblical interpretation, that space and that time did not exist. God existed, but none of that space and time existed. And if you're religious, you can say, you know what? There really wasn't nothing. There was always God, and therefore there was never nothing, and there was always something. But then people say, no, but I mean, well, God made the universe and the planets and put, things together and built these, clay models and called them humans or whatever. And it's the same question. So I think the point is, it's semantic. It's a debate. The concern that he raised is a semantic question and not a physics question. And the physics question, I repeat, is the remarkable realization that what we would have previously called nothing and what we'd previously called something are not very different, because they turn into each other a lot in physics. And maybe it's like that, and maybe, and he didn't, and so that's just life. I can't say it any differently.
Lawrence, speaking of the universe, they say there's 100 billion galaxies, each containing 100 billion stars.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just the sheer mind-numbing quantity
it is
of the stars. Does that point you to the majesty of God, or what does that point you to, assuming it came from nothing? I mean, it's
amazing. It's remarkable. It points me to the wonder of nature and the amazing features of the universe that I find much more remarkable than anything I read in the Bible. That's, I guess, the point. It's the universe is stranger than any Bible would ever invent. Nature has a much greater imagination than we do, and that's why we have to continue to look out and measure it. Because if you lock theoretical physicists in a room for 30 years, then the picture they'd come out with would be inevitably not at all like the picture of our universe, because our universe is far more interesting and unexpected. And every day, as I like to say, I think I said in the book, I'm surprised if I'm not surprised when I learn things. So the fact that the universe is so many galaxies and so many stars and even other things that are more exotic, black holes, and is fascinating and worth studying. And that's what I really the point of that book is to say, the universe is so amazing that you don't need the nonsense or the fairy tales. It's just but beyond that, if you don't want to be pejorative, the universe is so amazing that we should all be fascinated by it, and thinking about it is a wonderful thing, and it should be part of our culture to try and get some basic perspective of the amazing things that are the triumph of human intelligence, that we sitting here on this planet in the middle of nowhere have, without having really left our planet significantly, have nevertheless learned these amazing things of the universe on its largest scales and its smallest scales. That's worth celebrating. And it is amazing as the 100 billion galaxies, each containing 100 billion stars, is the properties of a cell or a snowflake. I mean, all these things are amazing.
Well, Lawrence, I think everybody, probably most people, certainly the people in our room tonight, agree with you on that, on both sides of the aisle, that it is amazing, remarkable, and something that ought to be studied and paid attention to in part of our culture. So I think everybody kind of agrees with you on that. I think we have a. Go ahead.
You have one? Okay, maybe I'll take one more question, but I want to address one thing that someone just pointed out, that I'm only interested in science. The point is, no knowledge comes from revelation. Let me just point to that. No knowledge comes. The only knowledge we get about the world is by exploring the world, and no revelation done in absence of exploring the world has ever led to increasing knowledge. So yes, if you want to call that science, you can call it science. But to me, if it doesn't come from studying the world around you and yourself, then it's not knowledge. It's just so I think that's an important point that is worth saying. And in fact, I've had this discussion with eminent theologians in the Vatican and elsewhere. And I once spoke at the 100th anniversary of a big lecture series at Yale, which was on this question with four apparently very eminent theologians and this pagan. But I've asked over and over again to theologians, give me an example over the last 400 years of a contribution to knowledge from theology. And the answer I always get is, what do you mean by knowledge? And I view that as a cop-out. Because if I asked a biologist or a chemist or a psychologist or whatever, they wouldn't say, what do you mean by knowledge? They'd give you a whole bunch of examples. And I think ultimately the reason we're progressing, and the reason the Bible is still the Bible, whereas science, the pictures of science are very different today than they were 10 years ago, and even when I wrote the book, is because we're learning, and we're learning because we're exploring the universe, so our pictures are changing. And I don't think it's a positive thing to say that the wisdom of the Bible hasn't changed, because the wisdom of science certainly has. Anyway, that ought to alienate some people. But anyway, James, you had one more. I think we'll take one more.
Let me go ahead and ask a final question. First of all, thank you so much again for taking time out of your busy schedule, especially that we have you here an hour longer than you were originally planning. And
it's okay.
So I really, really appreciate it.
I appreciate the patience of people.
Follow-up question from early on, Bill Cluck's question. This idea that life would evolve to fit whatever universe or puddle that it happens to evolve into, and so it has this appearance of being finely tuned, but it's only an apparition. Am I understanding correctly that if the expansion rate, for example, after the Big Bang was minusculely more or less than it was, then we wouldn't get the periodic table? We would get maybe hydrogen and helium, or maybe
no. Well, I mean, look, it's a subtle question. The answer is no. What you needed was a universe to survive long enough and have enough matter in it to collapse in certain places, and you'll get stars.
But now, expansion rate is one of those requirements, isn't it?
What was that?
The expansion rate. A precise expansion rate would be one of those variables.
It's really the expansion rate versus time, not so. And the universe would have been expanding very fast. The question is, what you have to ask yourself is what's the density of matter as a function of the expansion rate, and you could imagine a universe that expanded so fast there was no matter in it left. And clearly, in such a universe, if you have no matter, it's pretty hard to have stars. Although if you wait long enough in such a universe, you'll eventually get matter and eventually get stars, by the way, as I point out with the laws of quantum mechanics. So if you wait long enough, even in such a universe, you could have stars in life. Clearly, if there's too much, generally, if it's closed, such a system will collapse upon itself, until you allow for the possibility of an energy of empty space, where all of those old pictures go out the window. And what and what was surprising to physicists in the 1970s and 80s was that a 14 billion year old universe wasn't expanding fast enough, wasn't expanding far faster, or hadn't collapsed. Namely, that the universe had survived for 14 billion years without going to one or other of those extremes. But we now understand that once you add dark energy, once you add the energy of empty space, that that picture is again on its head, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. Yeah. That in some sense, in the far future, it depends on when you're asking the question. So if you ask, what you're really doing, it's a temporal question. If you ask, why has the universe got enough galaxies and planets now for life to be there? It's amazing. But in the universe in which we live, we know something for reasonably certain if the current parameters don't change. In the far future, there won't be planets. There won't be galaxies. The universe will be expanding faster and faster, and life won't exist in our universe. So it happens to exist right now. But in the far future, it'll be exactly the universe that you wondered why we weren't in now. So, I mean, the universe will go through that period where it'll become inhospitable for life in that sense, in the larger sense. And so the fact that we're not in it now is just the fact that it happens to be 14 billion years old, and we happen to be around in 14 billion years. But in the far future, it'll be much different. Just like in the far past, the universe was far too dense and hot for us to exist. Hey, so we happen to exist. We happen to exist at the one time in the history of the universe when we could exist. But again, that's not surprising. You can view that as fine-tuning, but it could have been, instead of 14 billion years, it could have been 140 billion years. But it happens to be when it happens to be, and that's just, it's an accident of existence.
By the way, Lawrence, you do the
very fortunate accident.
It's fortunate for us. Yeah, it's because we can have this conversation. I agree. It's a very fortunate accident, and I every day am thankful for that act. Well, not every day. Most days, I'm thankful for that accident.
Is there an object of your thanks?
What was that?
Is there an object of your thanks? Who are you thankful to?
It depends on the day. Most often, in many days, I'm thankful for my wife, who makes each day more interesting. But
good answer.
And I'm thankful of the laws of physics. And some days I'm thankful that I don't put my foot in my mouth like I may have many times in the last hour or so. But I don't thank any individual universally. Right. And I think that, but I will, let me just, once again, I guess it's Susan, I keep seeing these questions, is history is empirical. And let me point this out. I did history before I did physics. And I actually, and part of the thing I love about the books I write is writing about history. But history is empirical. I've gone to the archives and read letters, and that's how we know what happened. We didn't invent it. And we can check from history. And we, of course, can learn from it, we hope. Most of us don't. And let me end, I guess, with my favorite quotation from Mark Twain, who said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure rhymes a lot.
Well, Lawrence, do you have any final word of advice
for your
the
indulgence
atheists and the Christians?
Yeah, well, thanks for the good questions. They're good questions, and I understand at some level we're talking, for some of us, again, in ways that we can't meet. And I've had that happen when I was at the Vatican once, when a very distinguished meeting talking about the far future of the universe, when we realized that theologians' far future was very different than physicists' far future, which was very different than biologists' far future. But I hope that some of the things I've said have been useful. And primarily, I hope that what I will do, while I don't think I'll change any minds about deep questions about God necessarily, I don't really care if I do or not. I just hope that I have convinced you that the universe is sufficiently remarkable that it's worth learning more about. That's all.
So, Lawrence,
thanks again so much. We probably out of time there, Bill. So.
I just wanted to say he does the atomic clock or the universal clock, right, Lawrence?
Who does? Oh,
I saw a picture of you at the universal
the doomsday clock, not the atomic.
Quick question: how much time do we got left?
Well, I no longer do the doomsday clock.
Oh,
but I
okay,
used
so
to
we're
go.
good to go.
But it's nearly the last test. The last thing was either 100 or 90 seconds from midnight, and which doesn't bode well.
Dr. Krauss, we want to wrap up. We always want you to give us advice for Christians and non-Christians, so we'd love to have you do that. Also, my pet question for all of our atheist guests is, what do you think of Jesus?
What do I think of Jesus? I don't think much about Jesus. I do think that Jesus is overblown in the sense that, well, look, obviously some of the quotations from the Bible are wonderful, and so he sounds like a wonderful guy, except he talked about hell more than any other person in the Bible. And since I think hell is an obscene thing, on the other, I don't think it's so nice. So yeah, there's some great things that are in the Bible that can be guides for living to some extent, and there's some horrible things that should never be guides for living, and so you should pick and choose based on your rationality. As far as advice, I try not to give advice, and what I usually tell young people when they ask me for advice is, don't let the bastards get you down. but I think what I'll tell older people is, just don't ever give up, just keep plugging away.
Well, thank you so much for your kind use of your time to be here with us and to address the book club. Thank you for being part of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. And we hope to have you back to talk in the future sometime about one of your other books.
Sure. And thanks for all of you, as I say, putting up with all this and being willing to have these discussions. And I encourage you to continue them and keep using your rationality to assess what people say, whether it's me or anyone else. But thanks again. I enjoyed it, and I hope some of you did too. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, again, I want to thank everybody for being part of the Atheist and Christian Book Club with us, especially the new people. If you're new, this is your first time, if you could put a text message to us and let us know that, maybe how you heard about it. We appreciate letting us know about that. Reminder, our next book club, we're going to be looking at the... pull that up here. We're going to be talking about the return of the God hypothesis with Stephen C. Meyer, and then following that, we are going to be having Misquoting Jesus by Bart Ehrman. You can make a donation to help make that Bart Ehrman visit possible by going to watchman.org /Bart. Watchman.org/Bart. Thanks so much, and we will see you guys next time.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you, Dr. Krauss.
Thanks everyone. See you. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Okay, take care.
Thank you, Dr. Krauss.
Sure. Bye-bye.
Enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.